it is very daunting and very difficult to have like a relatively empty resume. I think the mentality is like, how can I be unique and different? How can I position myself in maybe a different way to stand out in the haystack, right?
This is the WorkInSports Podcast.
Riley Danford is the Senior Manager of Partnership Sales for the San Francisco 49ers. Growing up, he was a great baseball player. Riley has gone on to work for all 4 of the major sports leagues, hitting the career cycle. He worked for the Padres, the San Jose Sharks, the San Francisco 49ers, and the Portland Trail Blazers. So there's literally no one to better educate everyone listening on the various work environments of sports, how to pursue that first step, and how to grow through new opportunities. It's never as simple as it may seem. So listen up, pay attention, let's learn a little something with my friend Riley Danford. Hey Riley, what's happening? So excited to have you on the show today.
Brian, good to see you. Very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
We've been trying to do, so a little behind the scenes action. Riley and I have probably had to cancel and postpone and reschedule this 6 times. So I'm just really excited to see your face this morning and make this happen.
I joked this morning I'm probably on the short list of neediest guests ever. But very appreciative of your patience. It's been a hectic but really great time in my life with moving down here to the Bay Area, which we can get into. But yeah, a lot of fun and excited to be here.
Yeah, no, this is great. I'm just glad that we get to do it. So, okay, we have a lot of important topics to talk about. We have a lot of great advice we're going to share with the audience. But let's start out a little differently than that. On your Twitter profile, you call yourself a Uniform Czar. That piqued my interest. It's one of those things when I start doing research and I see something like that, I'm like, okay, got to ask about that. So explain.
Yeah, sure. It's like a bit on top of a bit. But
I like it already.
It kind of like plays into kind of my fiber. So, I grew up in an era where like I'm reading every sports blog that there is out there, ESPN Page 2, Bill Simmons.
Oh, yeah.
But my guy was Paul Lucas, who ran the UniWatch subset of Page 2 on ESPN. I couldn't get enough of that. And he would like drop links into every little mini uniform augmentation he found all across the uniform universe. And he would have writers write in and catch things that he missed. So that's always kind of been baked into my whole love for sport. And actually, I think it's kind of telling too, because in a lot of ways, like your uniform, your brand, your color scheme is the first thing that fans interact with, and it kind of lodges in their memory.
Yeah.
But some friends of mine in college, obviously, Bill Simmons was a huge, obviously podcasting and writing, and kind of his sense of style and humor has always been a part of our, inside jokes. And so over the years, I've had one particular friend refer to me as the Uniform Czar. So anytime that there's like a happening in the uniform world or a sports team rebrands, he'll always, reach out to me and say Czar ? And get my take on things. So, and I'll drop one bit of news. Leeds United, which is actually in the family here at the 49ers.
That's right. You guys, I forgot about that.
Which is a really exciting development. Just released their new home kit for the 23-24 season, and it looks really sharp, I must say. I'm not always a big fan of that particular manufacturer of uniform, but I think this one looks really good.
Oh, that's cool. I'm going to have to check that out now, too, because I was supporting Leeds a lot this last year because there were so many Americans on the team with Tyler Adams and Weston McKennie and Brandon Aronson. So I know their jerseys well, so I'm excited to see what you guys have done with them moving forward.
It looks really good.
Cool.
Really sharp color scheme.
Okay, well, I have to tell you, too, so I'm from Boston, which means I'm a Patriots fan, and that's where my loyalties live. But there's a guy that's a blogger in that area. He actually works for the Patriots now, but he had a whole database of like how the Patriots did based on what hoodie style Bill Belichick wore. And so that's right up your alley, man. There's like, he had a whole database on color schemes and whether their sleeves were cut off or what version it was of his hoodies, which he might compete with you for that Uniform Czar title.
Hey, that's some sicko stuff, and I love it. The whole like home road splits, wearing your dark uniforms on night games, I'm here for it.
I love it. Okay, so like I said, I tend to do a lot of research for these episodes, and this is perfect timing since we're in MLB draft season too. I checked you out, man. You had a pretty sweet, perfect game profile on you. 6 foot, 165, a legit high school baseball prospect. This was my favorite quote from your scouting report. He has a nice swing and he makes consistent contact. He's also an excellent student as well. So I laughed at that thinking, now looking back, you really leaned into the excellent student part since you're not playing in the major leagues right now. But what was that experience like?
I credit to you, Brian. You do your homework. Yeah, not in the major leagues, and I think a big part of that is that was written when I was a sophomore, and 6 foot really was my plateau.
That was the end of the
If I
story.
was a sophomore in high school, that was the end of the story. But no, sports was always such a critical part of my life, not only as like a recreational hobby, but just a source of friends, understanding kind of the basis for hard work, being able to like pour my attention into something. It was also something that my family bonded over, was baseball, going to Padres games. I grew up in San Diego, which is, obviously a hotbed for baseball, where you can play year round and kind of early, for better or worse, specialization in a particular sport. So, you name the league or the travel division, I was probably playing in it. And I think with most sports, you see this a lot in our industry, Brian. They recruit from former athletes because it breeds like a mentality of hard work and determination, but also coachability, the ability to kind of bounce back, and in particular in a sales position, like that ability to receive criticism or a no and kind of repurpose that as a win or kind of your next step in the process, I think is really important. And the excellent student thing. I was an okay student. My dad did a really good job growing up of kind of instilling this in me of like, treat school like it's your job when that's the most important thing, and kind of do your best in that role. And Perfect Game gave me a little shout. It's kind of nice too.
I like that little snippet you said there about the ability to bounce back. And I've always said that student athletes do often make the best hires, the competitiveness, the coachability, the teamwork, the leadership. Like there's a certain level of dedication it requires to be, focused on training and all the other responsibilities and travel, and yet still getting your studies done. So I do think it's a great feeder ground. I have so many student athletes that'll say, oh yeah, but I don't have a chance to do internships, or my schedule is too tight. It's like, you're getting great experience in just other ways. Looking at your story and background a little bit, college, University of Oregon, you jumped right in. You did internships, or at least volunteering work in the SID department, athletic comms, television broadcast. I like this attitude of trying out a myriad of things. Was that kind of your approach? Was, I'm going to try things, see what really resonates with me, and in the end, you ended up pursuing more sales related roles. How did that progression kind of come for you?
Yeah, for sure. It's a windy road. And, in some respects, I stumbled into this idea of being able to try a lot of different, or observe a lot of different mechanisms within an athletic department. But it really came from like a central theme of like, just get involved, right? Like for me, it ended up being sports information directing and kind of the communication side of the business. But, something I tell students I interact with in various volunteer work or classroom seminars is just get involved, whatever that means for you. Just give it a shot. For me, funny story, actually, I found this position on Craigslist of all places, and sent in, a resume, which at that time had Panera Bread associate on it. There wasn't much to it, right? It doesn't take a lot to get involved. It's half the battle is just going for it. And it turned out to be one of the best experiences I could have ever asked for, just with the exposures to those different divisions. Working in sports information, you're thrust what I felt like was a lot of responsibility, and in retrospect, maybe not so much, but you're kind of the engine behind the website, the broadcasts, the game entertainment for all the different sports that happen. And at University of Oregon, that's quite a few, upwards of 30 sports. Yeah. It paid on a stipend basis, which meant for every game I worked, I was able to collect a certain amount of money, which wasn't very much, but you would kind of hunt out the games that you wanted to be at. I always joked that the best games to work were the softball games, because they would run double headers. Those games would be over in 45 minutes and you collect 2 stipends and you're back to your weekend activities.
Strategic thinking at an early age. I like that.
Exactly. You got to be kind of coy with it. But, was able to work on a ton of really cool projects. My very first thing I worked on was actually the outgoing athletic director's resume. So very first project was sharpening up someone's resume, all the way to being the talent stats at a broadcast for ABC, ESPN for basketball. It really was everything and anything in between. And it kind of gave me this like sense of understanding of like how a business operates, like this sense of professionalism, but also to your point, kind of led me in the direction of like, all right, what do I see for myself? I don't think the communications arm of sports is necessarily for me, but I'm not really sure what is. And I know kind of when pro sports is maybe still the goal for me, like the ending in a large metropolitan city or working for, at the time a baseball team was really important. But without the context of that first role, I don't think it would have put me in a position to have that understanding. Because as we chatted about before this, like you think you know what you want to do, but until you kind of take that step and go for it and start to get that experience and dabble in a couple of different things, you're never really sure. And that's maybe a lifelong process for some people. I was just lucky enough to kind of have that as my first experience.
So that right after college, you get hired by your hometown team, the San Diego Padres. So you're from San Diego, you get hired by the Padres. That's not easy. Getting a big league job is hard. And then also getting a big league job in a market that you're familiar with. I mean, my first job, I'm from Boston. My first job was in Atlanta. I had never been to Atlanta before. So this is a unique part of the sports industry that often you have to relocate, which you have done a lot of. But, to get started in your hometown, working for the Padres, what do you remember about that hiring process? What stands out to you? And why do you think they ended up saying, yep, you're our guy, Riley?
Yeah, no, it's, I think this is a great point in my journey to recognize that I've been very, very fortunate to be surrounded by a lot of really great people who have not only taken the time to offer advice, but to, coach me up on my approach. And the reason why I say the approach is, it is very daunting and very difficult to have like a relatively empty resume stand out in a stack of the pool of people, sheer volume that would like to work in professional sports, let alone a baseball team, let alone in San Diego, right? So how do you go about pulling the right levers to stand out in the haystack, right? For me, legendary professor at the University of Oregon, Dennis Howard, he's running a lecture that I'm sitting in, and he kind of offhand mentions that we have a fellow Oregon Duck running the show down in San Diego. Now that turns out to be Jared Dillon, who's now the president of Orlando FC and one of my mentors in the industry. The story goes that he put on his calendar some Oregon kid to connect with for 30 minutes, but he gave me an opportunity to chat with him. And it was really less about any job openings per se. It was about, advice he had early on. And I think that's been really impactful in a number of ways, not only to get on the path to that first position, but just instilling in me the sense of like paying it forward and being able to be open to informational interviews and kind of helping the next generation that comes along. They had an inside sales, ticket sales position open. So that was one of the few that I had applied for. A couple others were on the East Coast. But the story goes is that I kind of built up this CV working at the SID Department of Oregon, where you're working on all these tactile projects. So anything from like a media guide that you're doing Photoshop work for, to writing bios, to the transcripts of a live event. I can't tell you how many times I sat through a tennis match and kind of did the live blog with parents that were overseas watching their kids through this live blog. So I have this big CV. And my approach was to overnight FedEx a box of my resume, CV, cover letter to the inside sales managers who I presumed were running the hiring process. So the story goes that Justin Peckus, another mentor of mine in the industry, did never open the FedEx box. The fact that I'd sent it was enough for him to think, okay, this guy's cool. worth a call. So, but yeah, it was, again, very lucky to land in a city that I was familiar with. I was like brought into that inside sales group with a class of other kids out of college, some a little bit further out of college than me, but to kind of be their guide to the city, but also see it through their perspective of a new place, oftentimes traveling from across the country, was really impactful for me. And then I mentioned Justin, but Jason Green, who's with the Clippers now, they were so influential in molding kind of what it means to work hard, to shape kind of the building blocks of sales culture for me. And we can kind of go into that about like what that role was, but that was kind of my story of how to kind of stand out. It's this, I think the mentality is like, how can I be unique and different? How can I position myself in maybe a different way? But then also kind of take advantage of the steps prior, which was connecting with my professor, making the outreach to the VP of tickets at the time, Jared, and kind of pulling on those levers.
I really want to hammer that. I was going to circle it back even if you didn't, but I want to make sure everybody really hears this. People ask me all the time. I'm sure they ask you all the time. How do I start networking? Who do I start networking with? The absolute best place to start is with alumni of your program. Like there's a warm feeling there with people out in the industry when they see, oh, this is a University of Oregon undergrad and that's where I went. There's a warm connection there. They're going to be willing to give you 30 minutes of a conversation. Start places like that. And that really worked well for you.
I couldn't agree more. I think if we were to go a layer deeper, it's that instant level of like shared experience.
Yeah.
And a big thing I like to talk about with networking is it doesn't necessarily need to be that you're like from the same part of the world or you went to the same school. Maybe it's like you like the jacket they're wearing, or like you think they have cool shoes on, or like you see something in their Twitter bio that resonates with you. It can be any number of things where it's not your first outreach to them isn't necessarily asking for something, because I think that's probably a pitfall in a lot of students or people kind of coming up in the industry's process is, instantly be like, can you do this for me? Or, XYZ. So the more you can lead with something that either brings value to the person you're reaching out to or creates a common bond first without any instant ask, I think is a huge tip I would give.
Plus 100. Agree on that completely. I love to hear it because I get a lot of outreaches, I'm sure you do too, where it's initially somebody asking me for something and I'm like, I can't operate that way. Like it just doesn't, I'd love to help everybody. It's just not scalable. So it's got to be a different approach to that. Okay. So that first gig with the Padres, how did you feel about sales initially? Because that's a big jump for a lot of people. A lot of the first jobs that are available in our industry tend to be in sales, but that doesn't mean everybody is meant for sales. So how did this fit well with your personality, and what did you kind of find out about yourself in those early years?
I mean, that is a huge question because I can answer it a number of different ways. I think to start, my eagerness to be working for a team that meant so much for me growing up, my mentality was like, I'm going to make this work because I knew that I didn't want to look back and say this was a poor experience. Did I know how to sell anything at that point? Absolutely not. Like I stumbled into a career where, I kind of gone to school for a marketing degree that kind of translated into a sports business and business management degree through Oregon's kind of specialization program. But for me, sales kind of represented this really like daunting, kind of like interesting lifestyle that maybe wasn't for me, maybe not all that creative. Boy, was I wrong with that. Yeah. And I think the parts of the aspects of my personality that worked really well for it initially was just that kind of athlete mentality of like, you get up and you do it again, because it takes a lot of repetition, not only to like hone your skill and your craft, but also to get and have success in a sustained basis. I think another pitfall too in this is that, I looked at it as I have this sports marketing background and I went to University of Oregon, blah, 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 like all these like sports, I had this AD thing. Some of the best sellers I've ever worked with, especially in that inside sales department, were people who had really diverse backgrounds of like what they went to school for. Yeah. And you learn that it's less about your teaching up to that point. It's how you can relate to people, tell stories, connect with people on something other than what you're trying to sell. And in this case, it was 95 loss baseball team without a face of the franchise, with kind of like an ownership transition, and the fan base isn't all that trustworthy of owner, the decision making. And I say that as a fan because again, this is a kid who went to probably 30 to 40 games a year at Jack Murphy and Qualcomm, and I still remember the outfield signage, and they had the clothing brand Gap out in left center field, and the Jerome was best team in the house. So I felt like I had all this like just like innate understanding of what the fan base has been through and kind of the history of the team, that I knew that I could impart that into my process. It was more a matter of like learning just the dogged determination it takes to make 100 cold calls a day and understand that you're going to get rejected 85 times out of those 100. Right. And then beyond that, it's how, learning to care in a way where, there were some days early on when maybe you dial 100 and 70 don't pick up, 20 are voicemails, and you actually have 10 actual conversations, and you get through the day, you're like, oh man, that was like relatively not that painful of a day. Because it's really hard to do that, just to strike up a conversation and say, hey, I'm Riley Danford with the San Diego Padres, and I just found out I'm going to be your personal ticket sales rep, and I see that you're coming out to games. Like, what's brought you out? Like, that's an exhausting process. But to learn how to think of it in terms of, if I'm not having these conversations, I'm not pushing my business forward. If I'm not pushing my business forward, I'm not making money. I'm not advancing my career in that way. So kind of learning that process, understanding that it's more or less about attitude and kind of that will than it is about just like being at the right team at the right time in the right circumstance, which is kind of a winding way of saying like the athlete in me married up with the student in me in that first job.
It's awesome. I love how you were able to nail that intro script right away too. Like you were picking up, it was like you were cold calling just then. I'm Riley Danford with the Diego Padres. Like you still recall.
I'm still on a text thread
memory
with a lot of my inside sales class, and I think every one of us to a T could probably like from memory.
Oh, I bet
hit that, because then the challenge becomes
like, I would hope, yeah.
It's like the challenge is to become less robotic and have it sound more natural, and it's such a fun and like unique experience to go through that as a first job, where you're in this room, you hear everyone's calls, and like you're bonded with these people, and you're doing a really difficult job, but everybody has higher aspirations, and you're trying to be there and like a teammate. It really is that kind of like locker room. That you don't get, that athletes always talk about is once they're out of the sport. But yeah, it was a amazing position to learn the basics behind negotiation, like positioning, kind of like listening as a skill, which I think kind of gets lost on a lot of people these days, is it has to be here and now and transactional, but the art of listening and to like process and understand what people are saying before you have something to say back is something you learn in that role. Whereas going into it, you kind of, and I think everybody's guilty of this, you kind of craft what you're going to say before the other person's even done speaking. But think how many good conversations that's ever led to at like a party or a networking event. Probably not very many.
It's true. And there's so many parallels, because I started out in the broadcast media and same sort of almost locker room environment. All of us were working late. It was a lot of young people graduating college, coming into these roles, editing game highlights, watching games, shooting the shit over games, like that kind of stuff. And then also like learning how to interview other people and have those kind of conversations. And it's the same end result. You have to be an active listener rather than thinking about what you're going to say next. Different roles, but like I feel so many of the parallels of what you're saying, and that ability to be a good listener and not just be thinking about your next words coming out of your mouth robotically to follow a script is a skill. It's a learned skill. I'm really intrigued by this. You had from day one a passion for baseball. That's very clear. You were from San Diego. You got a job at the San Diego Padres. That to me feels like an edge case. Like that doesn't happen a lot from my experience talking to a lot of people. In your recollection, or if your advice to others, would you suggest young people follow a sport they're passionate about and really try, like, I love the NFL, I want to try to get a job in the NFL? Or is it more stay broad, try to find a good opportunity at a stable organization or stable business or whatever it may be, and figure things out as you go? What advice would you give to people that are out there looking right now?
I lean the latter. And the reason I do is that to close yourself off to opportunities just because they're outside of a sport you're more comfortable with or more passionate about, if you have larger goals of being in the industry long-term, could preclude you from a growth opportunity that would serve you later on. If you're in a position where you're lucky to have options, which is something that does not come around very often fresh out of college, it's maybe a little bit of a different equation, right? Where you can lean towards either a particular region or city or sport that could then translate into your passion for the work. I think the potential pitfall there is thinking that just because you played baseball growing up and you're from a particular town and now you're working for that hometown team means that you're going to have success. That's not necessarily the case. And I can I think about that in terms of a few roles down the line for me when I was working for the San Jose Sharks. I knew nothing about hockey. I had been living in the Bay Area for about a year, a little less than a year. And all of a sudden, a minor league hockey team is relocating into the Bay Area, and it was my role to go out and sell sponsorship for it. If I had that job right out of college, I probably wouldn't have known any different. I would have just launched into it and looked at it as a great opportunity and gone for it. Versus when you're a little bit later into your career, you have a little bit more jurisdiction on the path that you take and if that's something you're passionate about. At the time, I had grown to know that like this industry is a career for me. It's not just a job. And this is the best opportunity on paper to be able to advance me to the next position to ultimately have more success. But out of college, it's not always the case, as we know. And so I would recommend taking a more broad approach, trusting the people around you. Don't make these decisions in a vacuum. Understand that the path to success doesn't necessarily have to be A, B, C in a linear fashion. It can wind a little bit. It can be a sidestep. It could be a step back. But something I try to impart on people a lot is like, understand your own story, be able to position yourself in a way of like, why did you do X or why did you do Y? And I think from that perspective, you can't fail. So long as that you're making an impact and doing good work at the positions you're at. But if you have that story that can kind of weave together the decisions you've made, that's as good as any resume.
I love that. I think it's so smart. It's hard to, in our industry, I mean, everybody knows sports is huge, but it's a small world too. And you don't want to close yourself off many opportunities. You want to look as far and as wide as you can. And I think it's really interesting because right now you are the senior manager for partnership sales at the San Francisco 49ers, which means you have hit for the career cycle. You are probably one of the first interview guests that I've had that have worked in all four of the major league sports. You worked in the Major League Baseball for the Padres, as we mentioned. You just mentioned the San Jose Sharks in NHL. You worked for the Portland Trail Blazers in the NBA, and now twice for the San Francisco 49ers. So you've been open to every opportunity, which I love, except you seem to be against the East Coast. You're kind of but other than that, as you've traveled through the different sports, do you notice a lot of nuances and difference in approach or in personas or in potential market that you're addressing? Or is it sports, pro sports, they're all kind of similar?
Another good question. It's a little bit of both, and it's a lot case by case. So the model as a whole, team to team, doesn't change. You have your, tried and true revenue streams that are fairly consistent. Now, the size and scope of each of those tend to vary based on the league and based on the team. For example, the revenue sharing model in media in football is a lot different than the RSN network. RSN model with pro basketball or baseball, as we're seeing. I think what doesn't change is, particularly in like a fairly straightforward revenue role, is the need to understand your position in the market, understanding the value you bring to a particular company or business that has a certain set of challenges or needs, and presenting yourself as a solution in such a way. I think team to team, what I've discovered is that teams really are small businesses, a lot of them like family run in a lot of ways. And so they have these unique set of values that a lot of like larger corporations tend to lose sight of. And a partnership with a team can mean kind of reinvesting in some of those core values that brands like to talk about. So my experience working for different teams in different leagues, again, it's largely like case by case, but the broader scope of like how the teams make money are relatively the same. My experience across each are kind of fun though. There's pros and cons to each of them. In baseball, you have this massive canvas of the season where you have 80 plus home games to tell a story, to engage with clients, to sell inventory. On the downside, you're working a lot and you're there a lot of nights. And I think you've seen like the culture within baseball relax a little bit. So it's not quite as, suit and tie every single home game. And this is not to like, stand on my soapbox, but my early memories of working Padres games were you were standing out at a sales table and trying to get people to walk up and spin the wheel for a seat upgrade and talk to them about, ticket packages. In football, it's a little bit more like this blue chip mentality where you're the big kid on the block and it's our role to represent as such. But at the same time, football represents something that is like so relatable to so many people here, particularly those who have like pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and built a company or like are in a position to make decisions and are managing people. And this idea of like a 22 player field is like really intriguing in that perspective. I think it really relates to the business mind. Then you flip the script and talk about hockey and it's like, well, those are some of the most passionate sports fans you're going to find, right? Like it indexes right up there with NASCAR from like a ability to follow the brand and feel like they're supporting the team through buying goods and services through partners. And the way that we would translate that into success off the field was kind of leveraging that passion. And then to close out with basketball, it's kind of a little bit of both, right? You're kind of selling more the visibility. It's more of a global game, like the way that they've marketed and moved towards like this international model, I think is really positive and brought a lot of really good things into our organization. But you're kind of positioning off of that in terms of scope and how many eyeballs are on the team. So it's less about, my MBA defined marketing rights and more or less like, here's a generation of kids that relatively are not as into sports as the previous generation, but they're really into YouTube. And how can we reach them on a platform like that where our partner brands are receiving exposure and bringing an additive element to watching their game? So, I mean, my experience has been different across each team and league, but all super, super positive. And I'm just happy to be back in the NFL. I know you mentioned this is my second time here, but I guess that's kind of a rambly version of that.
No, it's all good. So I have a friend in sports recruiting, and I asked them recently, what's the hardest role for you to fill? Where's that big challenge? So when I was working in television, it was always really hard to find good technical directors. That was like a hard role to fill. And he said, without blinking an eye, he said, partnership sales and sponsorship sales, 100% hardest roles to fill. He said it was hard to find the people with the right mix of skills for these positions. Two-part question for you. Does that surprise you to hear, since this is your ecosystem? And what do you think are those skills that are paramount for success in partnership sales? If somebody out there is listening and saying, wow, everything Riley's saying sounds really interesting to me, what is that mix that they need to develop?
Yeah, another great question. I'm going to start at the end because I think that's probably most important to people listening. I think number one, it takes creative thinking. And that's not necessarily like, how can I align a sponsorship campaign to we call them assets here within the scope of the team. And maybe that equates to like a sign or a call out in the broadcast. I think of creative thinking as I am listening to this prospective partner and they're outlining a certain set of problems or initiatives that they're having challenges with. How can I prescribe a solution that works to accomplish those goals for them and creates a win-win situation for us? Because at the end of the day, as much as my title may say sales, it really shouldn't feel like a sale. It has to be a win-win, or else it's no good for either party. Whether it's the person who controls the purse strings on the opposite side of the table, or for our side, the last thing we would like is a partner that goes through the cycle of the term of their contract and doesn't renew. So we want long-standing relationships. I think the second thing is task management. This is something that I struggle with and have to consciously work on daily. But the idea, who doesn't, right?
Right.
But the idea of having multiple projects on various paths and at different points in those paths, often running parallel to each other, can be a challenge. Oftentimes it steps into worlds outside of your partnership bubble. And so the ability to kind of manage those programs, but keep yourself organized is really paramount. And then I think the last thing that I think translates really, really well to a sports sponsorship role and really sales role in general is empathy and the ability to lead with understanding and compassion and earnestness. Because at the end of the day, like, we're creating relationships first. You're selling yourself, really, instilling that trust in the product or the service, and then welcoming them into what we call the family, which is not hyperbole. Like, they are part of our world, whether they like it or not. We spend 90% of our time talking about outside companies. That's just the reality of our departments. And so I think the more that especially kids coming out of school can learn to lean into their EQ and understand that, positioning, being able to read the room, having empathy, it translates really, really well to the revenue side, in my opinion. And the best leaders, which I've been really, really fortunate to work for a lot of really great people, all have that high on their skill set. Is it a difficult role to find? I think probably the numbers would say yes. Certainly, Brian, your example of a friend in the hiring and recruiting world seems to think so. I think there might be a number of factors that lead to that. It's tough to talk about this too, as someone who's in this role, because I don't want to like tout it too much as like, this is like the end all be all. But I do think it takes a level of success to get to this role for management teams to trust that you can accomplish the job, right? And for me, that looked like selling tickets at a high level to get to the point where I was entrusted with the opportunity to represent the team from a brand perspective. And what I mean by that is, when you're selling tickets, it's largely a one-size-fits-all solution. Whereas in a sponsorship world, you're representing so many different aspects of the business and have to speak intelligently to what everybody else is working to accomplish, that it instills this need for having experience, right? So that's number one. Number two, what do highly successful sellers from an early age graduate to? Management positions.
Yeah.
So I think what you see is a lot of successful sales managers who want to get into the management side it naturally creates this vacuum for like veteran sellers of the actual sponsorships, if that makes sense.
It does.
And then I think the third factor that you probably see, and this maybe is a little bit outside of my knowledge, but just like anecdotally, what I see is that, like any industry, there's an element of poaching that happens where if you're doing well at one thing, there's going to be another industry that takes notice and you become more valuable the way you can position it. And if you're really good at that element of positioning your own brand you work for, you're probably good at positioning yourself as well. So you see a little bit of that as well, that too. Yeah. What I'm encouraged by is that there doesn't seem to be any drop off in interest in this role. So if I'm your friend in this recruiting position, I'm sure it's not a matter of want. It's just a matter of like, are there enough people further down the pipeline funnel that are working to hone their craft?
Yep.
And the hope that I have as a future manager is that people are being given the right tools so that when they're in position to raise their hand and say, I'm ready for a sales position, maybe they're moving out of an activation role into a sales position or vice versa, that they've kind of had that seasoning to be at a place where they can step into a little bit more responsibility. As I mentioned, responsibility in this case being representing and kind of being the mouthpiece for the other departments within an organization.
This is such a great conversation. I want to be respectful of your time too. So we'll wrap up with this. I think one aspect of the sports industry that we probably don't give enough oxygen is the teamwork aspect. We don't tend to work in silos. Yes, it's a sales department, but you cross over amongst a lot of different groups. And to be successful in any of our roles, there is a lot of cross-functional work. There are other people that you rely upon. When you're working in your group or at different organizations or whatever, how important is that to identify those people who work well as part of a team? How important is it to have that as part of your skill set to be successful in the sports industry?
I would say it's paramount. And it should be top of the list of anybody who's an aspiring candidate to work in sports, is this idea of how are you going to raise others around you up? And B, like, how receptive are you going to be to being coached and being told that maybe your way isn't the best way? And what that creates is this attitude that where everybody wants to be better, and that team can really shine. I think that you hear a lot of like, you spend the most time around the people you work with, even more than your families and stuff like that. And it is true in all industries, but particularly in sports where we're working nights and weekends and travel. We're heading to Tahoe here in a bit for a prospecting event. And you spend a lot of time around these people. You need to invest in those relationships first. But just having that attitude or that backdrop of like, I can be successful within the structure of a team is, I would say, of the utmost importance. But really, what does that come back to? It's the ability to be coached, the willingness to be empathetic, to invest yourself in others, to be able to share your story and find common ground with your teammates. And that positions you to be really successful, because what you're going to find when you do that is that people are much more willing to help you or like coach you along or like be a mentor. If you're open and receptive and understanding, polite and respectful and all those things, right? Which all kind of funnel back into being a good teammate.
Love that. Riley, oh gosh, what a great conversation. Thank you so much for sticking with me and making sure we could schedule this and have this happen, because I know our audience is better for it. I know I am as well. So thank you so much for coming on today. Such great advice.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Thanks to Riley for coming on the show. Really enjoyed that conversation. I love that he has experience in all the different work environments in sports, the nuance, the personas, the approach, the strategies, because it does vary between leagues and it does vary between audiences. And for somebody like him working in partnership sales, boy, big upside, a lot of potential there, a lot of earning potential there. And seeing it from his point of view on how he's pursued his career has really been interesting. So thanks to Riley for coming on the show. Thanks to all of you for listening, and I'll see you next week.